everyone. My name is Klaus Weber. I'm the Deputy Director of the Northwestern Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. And I welcome you back to our webinar series, Building Sustainable Futures, Global Challenges and Possibilities. We consider different United Nations Sustainable Development Goals each quarter. And this quarter, the spring quarter, we'll be looking at SDG 10, reduced inequalities. Now that SDG includes inequalities across the globe between countries, but also within societies. The series is co-sponsored by the Northwestern University Community for Human Rights. And what we try to do is to explore the historical and present day structures that produce economic, social, health, and educational inequalities, and sort of look a little bit deeper where they come from, where the inequalities that we see, the injustices that we observe, where they originate, and leverage that understanding to create visions for a more just and equal future. Today, I'm super excited to welcome our speaker, Amara Enyia. Amara is a community organizer, activist, politician, consultant, academic. She advises on municipal and foreign policy, and she's currently the managing director of Diaspora Rising. She also holds a JD and a PhD from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And quite a few of you will probably recognize her as a mayoral candidate for the city of Chicago in 2015 and 2019. So she combines a really unique range and breadth of insights. And her presentation today will examine historical and present exploitative trade and economic practices in Africa and the Caribbean to really shed light on how relationships of power within and between the global south and the global north affect the inequalities that are so persistent and create lasting problems that we try to solve. So welcome and thank you so much for being with us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Klaus, for having me. And I also want to thank the Buffett Institute for the webinar series, which I think is phenomenal and very timely, as well as for the invitation to talk on this subject that I think is very appropriate as we hopefully are looking at the light at the end of the tunnel with the COVID pandemic and how things are shifting locally, nationally, and definitely around the globe. So it's a pleasure to be here and to all who are joining for this discussion. So I'm just going to give a brief overview and a brief conversation, sort of presentation on the subject matter. And then the goal is to really have ample opportunity for questions from the audience. So feel free to, I guess, type your questions if you have them, and we'll have plenty of time at the end of the presentation for us to dive in. I'm going to share my screen now briefly with all of you, just so that you have a sense of what we're going to cover for the bulk of the presentation and sort of the subject matter. And so this talk is really about examining some of the most entrenched systems of inequality that we're experiencing, and that have been exacerbated, particularly over the last little more than a year, and what it takes to build systems of parity. And by talking about building systems of parity, it means how do we shift our existing frameworks, what's actually happening around the world, and particularly in Africa, in the Caribbean, what new developments are happening, how are systems being transformed, realigned, and then what does parity look like? There are existing paradigms of aid, existing paradigms of development, but what does it look like for those who have typically been disadvantaged to actually have more parity with, in this instance, we're talking about the global north, we're really looking at countries that have had advantages and have been able to develop. And so that's what we'll cover for the bulk of this discussion. And I'm focused on the continent in particular because there is so much that is happening there now that's relevant to not just, it actually preceded the pandemic, but now it's become even more critical to assess as we're moving into this new phase, this new paradigm. And so it's important to really understand the colonial history when we talk about Africa and we talk about the countries in Africa, and just giving sort of a brief overview of what that historical context is. Specifically, looking at the role of the West, or in some instances we call it the global North, and how they have typically their relationship with African countries as what I call here company states. And I also was intentional about using the air quotes after independence. What we know, obviously, is that most of the major countries that we think about, whether it was England, France, Germany, Belgium, that engaged on the continent as very extractive. So this was, of course, the advent of the transatlantic slave trade, which was the loss of human capital, then distributed around the world. But that's a significant loss of human capital for the countries in Africa, for African people. In addition to the loss of human capital, the significant loss of human capital, we saw that many of these countries that did in fact have extensive natural resources, that became the centerpiece for what's called the development of these company states. Essentially, the country served as a company for the colonizer. So we can look at the even examples like the British East India Company. We can look at what happened in Nigeria with oil. We can look at many other instances where resources such as gold, cobalt, they were used to essentially enrich and allow for Western nations to be able to develop. And so you see in one instance the halting of the ability of the right to develop in the case of Africa and all of the countries in Africa. That was severely interrupted through the slave trade and through the extraction of natural resources. And simultaneously, you're seeing the rapid development of these Western nations, particularly European nations, that used Africa and her resources across the board for their own development. This is how, when we move into the industrial age, when we see the massive rise of industry, it was fueled in large part through that major interruption on the continent. And so when we talk about independence, a lot of times people think it's just the moment of freedom. But what in fact occurred is that the colonial entities established frameworks that allowed for the continued resource extraction of these countries even after independence. So we know that independence was largely in the 60s and 70s. And after that, still, there were economic arrangements that ensured that these countries were still the resources were still being essentially extracted and going to benefit the economies of these now former, what we would call former colonies, but they were still getting the resources. And in many instances, these were formal agreements, they were formal arrangements. You also had more insidious practices. For example, if you look at what happened when, in one instance, after, I believe it might have been the Belgians when they were leaving, or the French, in fact, and things like sewage systems and things that had been built up in those places, they would pour cement into the drains to kind of close up those systems that had been built, and things were destroyed. So it wasn't sort of, in some instances, it wasn't a peaceful exit. There was actually a certain level of destruction to ensure, apparently, that the countries themselves would have to start from scratch. So again, even as you're seeing them physically leaving, the economic framework, the political framework was permanently changed. And also in some instances, a lot of destruction occurred at that point. And so we have to understand that history, if we're looking at the current state of the countries in Africa, and also naming the Caribbean, many of the Caribbean colonies, Caribbean areas, of course, served as colonies for sugarcane plantations. They were primed for that. In some instances, of course, they also, people from India were also brought to the Caribbean to work on these plantations. So this was the basis for the economy that we now call developed. This was the basis for a lot of the wealth that we're seeing in the global north, but it was simultaneously the basis for the destruction of the economy and the sort of interruption that we're seeing in these places. And so I mentioned that. I mentioned, for example, the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially established the U.S. presence and influence in the West, in the Caribbean. It made sure that other countries, the U.S. itself was saying essentially to France and to the UK that we basically are the only ones who want to have a longstanding interest in the Caribbean. It didn't interrupt the French interests in Haiti or other existing interests, but it said that there will be no other expansion of the UK or France in the area because the United States wanted to play that role. And so an example is the US occupation of Hispaniola, which is the Dominican Republic in Haiti, for 19 years. And a lot of people are not aware of that fact, that there were occupations that were facilitated by the United States in the Caribbean as well, to again establish this relationship that in many instances was extractive to serve the interests of the United States in the same way that the African countries existed, their existence served the interests of building up the economies and the structures and the societies of the West. And so we can't look at the current economic framework without acknowledging very plainly and very candidly that historical context. So when we fast forward to today, we're seeing some shifts that are happening, particularly on the continent. And so the one that I wanted to focus on for the purposes of this conversation is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Now, the AfCFTA, which is how it's more broadly known, was initiated before the COVID pandemic, so it's not a new thing that's emerged because of COVID. It actually has been a part of the African Union's Agenda 2063 for quite some time. And it is along other priorities that the AU has established, for example, really trying to move toward a unifying framework for the continent that includes a single passport, free travel on the continent between countries, an economic system that is much more unified. Obviously, the continent is incredibly diverse, and that brings with it its own set of challenges. And so the AU Agenda 2063 sets forth some of the goals of the African Union that they are trying to achieve, and the AfCFTA is one of those. It establishes a strategic framework for delivering on the goal of an inclusive and sustainable development across the continent. It is headquartered in Accra, Ghana. This was established just last year when it was launched officially on January 1st. Unfortunately, it, like many things, ended up being delayed from last year because of COVID. But the big goals of the AfCFTA are what make it probably one of the biggest developments or the biggest things to sort of come out of the continent since that wave of independence in the 60s and 70s. And so the AfCFTA's goal, one, is to boost Africa's trading position in the global marketplace, to accelerate the growth of intra-African trade, and then to strengthen Africa's common voice and policy space. And so when you look at all of the countries in Africa, the amount of trade happening between the countries is incredibly small. So one would think they're all next to each other, they're all on the same continent, they must be trading a lot with each other, and that's just not the case. So the amount of trade is actually between countries is quite small. Now, these countries do trade outside of the continent. So for example, the United States since 2000 has had AGOA, which is the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a trading relationship that is supposed to give countries in Africa with the United States access to the US market. That's been sort of the United States' flagship way of engaging the continent as it relates to trade. But even with mechanisms or vehicles like AGOA, you still do not see a large amount of trade happening either from the US to Africa, any African country, and vice versa. But that's been the framework. And so within the continent, one of the things that has really just become very apparent over the years is that African countries should be trading amongst themselves. That when they're able to trade with each other, when they're able to build their economies amongst themselves, it builds more self-sufficiency, it builds a stronger economy, and it also can mitigate some of the challenges of having trade relationships, things like access to the supply chain, or in many instances, you'll have countries that end up exporting their natural resources to be refined and then bringing them back to Africa, which is incredibly inefficient. And you see that particularly in a lot of, when I referenced earlier, company states like Nigeria, where oil refining for such a long time had been exported to refine the oil and then bringing it back into the country. Those challenges existed because of the infrastructure or the lack thereof, the inability to really perform those functions in the country, and having to now ship out to countries that were better equipped to do so. So it's incredibly inefficient, and has led to just the slow rate of growth and development in spite of the natural resources and the abundance on the continent. And so that's one of the things that have emerged sort of as the AU developed the AfCFTA, is really trying to build that self-sufficiency, build the continent's own infrastructure, build the economies so that they can actually trade with each other and realize some of the benefits of what a stronger economy, both individually and collectively, would look like. And so it's a huge undertaking. So the AfCFTA is the largest free trade area measured by the number of countries participating in the world. It connects 1.3 billion people across 55 countries. And it is a combined GDP valued at $3.4 trillion. So it's a huge undertaking, but it has such vast potential to really lift, just in the early preliminary analysis, to lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty and drive $450 billion in potential income gains. And so we're talking about what it takes to increase income, increase household income, what it takes to increase GDP in these countries. But again, a lot of the impetus for this is about building self-sustaining, self-sufficient economies at the country level and at the continental level, and also reshaping the way Africa and African countries engage with the rest of the world, which again has been often through the lens of aid or development aid, and more to a lens of parity, and actually engaging with other countries on par, meaning not just being on the economic agenda as a resource or as a source of extracting resources, but actually having their own robust economies where they can engage in ways that are beneficial to them. And that is incredibly important. So again, this has been a huge undertaking with the ratification by so many African countries, and then the official launch, which took place on January 1st, to some fanfare. You didn't really hear too much about it in the United States, but it's a really big deal for those who are interested in what's happening on the continent and understand historically what this means for the continent moving forward. Another big part of the AfCFTA and sort of the direction that the continent has been moving is a couple of things that we're seeing. One is encouraging repatriation. So this has been just concerted efforts, particularly to reach back to the Black diaspora, meaning anyone around the world with African ancestry, whether in North America, South and Central America, in Europe, in Asia, recognizing that Africans are everywhere. And this has been an agenda, again, with the African Union, to say that we recognize that it's not just Africans that are in the continent, but that the diaspora is still considered a part of Africa. And that if Africa is to move in this new direction, that we have to encourage people to repatriate, to come back, to invest, And so you're seeing, for example, in Ghana, they had the year of return. It's been a big draw for people to go back. The tourism is really around cultural tourism, people being able to go back and experience the culture, but also it's about learning more about your roots and African ancestry and creating avenues to do that. There's also this notion that the development of the continent won't happen just with the continent itself, but that the diaspora has a major role to play in ensuring that the continent can move forward with the vision that they have established. And so encouraging repatriation, at least encouraging people to come back, particularly reaching out to the Black diaspora from anywhere and everywhere in the world, has been a priority. Also encouraging direct investment. This has been huge when we look at people looking for investment opportunities and looking at markets and where there's a lot of potential. A lot of times African countries are overlooked, and this is due in part to the perceptions of the different countries in Africa. This is due to media narratives about what it means or what it entails to engage with any country on the continent. And so the mix of the media narratives, common perception, or perhaps learning more about the negative things on the continent, it creates sort of this hesitance or creates a fear of investment, that you won't get your return on the investment, things of that nature. And yet we know that there are so many opportunities because the market has not been, in many sectors, saturated as you would find, for example, in the United States or in Europe. And it's one of the areas where innovation is happening at a rapid rate. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that about 50% of the continent is under 35. So you have the youngest population also, which means an incredible opportunity for access to the market when you have such a young population on the continent. So it is attractive if you are, and this is getting to the next point, my third point, if you're getting into, if you're an entrepreneur, if you do have a business, if you're looking for access to markets, it's actually a prime investment opportunity. It's a prime place if you are an entrepreneur to launch a business, to engage. Obviously, you would do your research first to make sure that you understand how to navigate. But these efforts are underway. So you'll see a lot of conferences popping up, connecting Africa to the diaspora and vice versa. You'll see a lot of push for entrepreneurs and for investment opportunities on the continent. And that's all as we're looking at how the economies are being reshaped and how they're moving toward really opening up to build the kinds of economic landscape that's attractive both within the continent, but also external to the continent. And so that's a phenomenon that's really accelerated, I think, over the last few years. And so the question then is, what does it look like? What does parity look like with this shifting that we're seeing and with the political realities that we're witnessing around the world? And by political, I mean, the axis of power is shifting. Those that countries that were previously sort of in center stage might be reshifting or moving into other positions. You could argue that the United States has kind of had a shift for 4 years that had implications on how it's positioned in the world stage. And so these things are happening, these shifts are happening. And what does it look like to have parity and to engage with other countries given these shifting political realities and economic realities? Also, what does it look like to move toward economic independence? Again, from a history of colonial extraction and exploitation of human capital and natural resources, what does it look like to sort of move away from those tentacles? A couple of interesting things happened recently. One is that we saw last year several Francophone countries in West Africa decided that they were going to move away from the CFA franc, which is the currency, the French currency that they currently use locally. And without going too deep into the details on that, it's really kind of a shocking moment, but it's a very telling moment because when the CFA franc, when the local currency is pegged to the CFA franc, what it means is their relationship, it's sort of a cementing of their relationship with France. It's a relic of the colonial past, but it ties them into France in a way that they're not truly free. Their economy is not truly free. Now, they would argue that there are some benefits for that, things like stability, avoiding hyperinflation, those sorts of economic occurrences. But again, it is still tying them to that colonial past. And so last year we saw several of the Francophone countries deciding that they wanted to actually move away from the CFA franc. Now that's a long process, and it's not sort of a linear process. But again, what it is saying is that there are some shiftings that are taking place in how these countries are renegotiating their relationship to former colonial powers. And that's important because I think we're only going to see more of that. And what that means is they're able to now assert their standing in a way that they did not do and had not done for decades. Even more recently than that, we witnessed the president of Ghana giving a speech where he essentially told, uh, he essentially said that cocoa is a major export, it's a major industry in many countries, but he essentially said that they were going to now start processing cocoa within Ghana. And this is a major development, particularly with their relationship to Sweden, to Switzerland also, that I did not mention in the slide, which has been the partner for Ghana for many, many years in processing cocoa. Obviously, people know Swiss chocolates. Well, where are they getting their cocoa from, right? And so for the president of Ghana to make that declaration in front of the very entities that he was saying we're no longer going to be, essentially exporting our products there to be refined, that's a huge shift. It's a huge shift, one, in the boldness of being able to declare that. But two, it again indicates that there are these steps that are being taken to bring back or to develop internally some of the necessary capabilities that since so-called independence and since the colonial era had been exported and had been done sort of in these European countries. And they're not saying, well, we want to do it ourselves. And after all, why shouldn't we? And why shouldn't we also capture the value from that? And so if you looked in the video, and maybe I'll be able to send it in a link after this webinar, but you can see everyone's faces, and the look is just sort of like, oh, we weren't expecting that to happen, or we weren't expecting him to say that. But again, it's very telling because it means that countries are starting to renegotiate how they engage with the other countries that formerly had, this hold on their economy, on their political system. And so that shifting toward more independence, that shifting to self-sufficiency has major implications for trade relationships, for how they engage, and also for power dynamics. Because again, it is now asserting that being on par with countries that formerly had subjected these countries, particularly African countries and countries in the Caribbean, to oppressive policies, oppressive tactics, and incredibly destructive and extractive strategies that they used for development. So the last sort of area that I want to just touch on before we go into the conversation is this question of international solidarity. What does international solidarity look like? As we know, with the rise of the COVID pandemic and also the development of the vaccine, this notion of making sure that no country gets left behind with the vaccine, that with something like a global pandemic, you cannot afford to you can isolate, but you have to take the necessary steps to mitigate COVID-19, because with travel, it could come from anywhere. It could come from any country. And so we can't afford to ignore it. So we're seeing a lot of that, particularly with everything shutting down and saying, well, a pandemic doesn't look at what country you're from to decide if you're going to get infected. And so every country has a vested interest in taking all of the necessary steps to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. And so out of that arose this notion of international solidarity. What does that look like? And so on the pandemic side, you could say there was a lot of conversations around making sure with COVAX that more poor countries or underdeveloped countries did not get left behind. What we've seen more recently is that in spite of these pledges for international solidarity, that wealthy countries essentially bought up the vast majority of vaccines and have been rapidly vaccinating their entire populations, and other countries are sort of left with whatever is left, and they haven't been able to get as much access. So even with declarations of international solidarity, we're still seeing that the developed world has used their wealth to gain as much as they could from the vaccines that are available, while other countries are not able to do that. So we have to think about, what does solidarity look like, and how do we create the circumstances where that solidarity is real or is a thing? And one way is to look at some developments that are happening now as it relates to tax revenues. And so there are conversations that are happening, for example, at the OECD, where we're talking about sharing profits and what it looks like to recapture tax revenue that's lost to a country. So we know that things like in the United States, in the US, for example, offshoring, there's a lot of lost revenue that's not captured by the United States government because tax dollars are, shared, are stored offshore in tax havens. So there are these conversations that are happening around, well, what do we do with profits, or how do we even tax multinational corporations, and how are those profits shared? And what does progressive taxation of income and wealth, and in particular wealth, what does that look like, rather than just looking at a minimum tax on the profits of multinationals? And the reason why these current conversations are important is because as we're seeing income inequality increasing, we see it here, we see it in Chicago, we see it in the US, and you're seeing it around the world, this gap between the haves and have-nots. We can look at the number of billionaires that have been created during the pandemic, and simultaneously looking at the number of people who have dropped further and further, even out of the economy, of economic participation completely. So this is a huge question. It's a huge issue. And so as we're talking about it, though, what is not sufficient, and this is something that I argue, is that we can't just talk about tax sharing sort of in this way of, we'll just give whatever extra to some of these other countries. We cannot construct an economic system that takes the same approach as what we found, that the notions of aid and providing aid to other countries. One, because most of the developed countries and the wealthy countries built their wealth and were able to develop directly because of their extraction and essentially destruction of economies in what they're now calling poor countries, right? So the countries probably would not be poor, or at least to the extent that they were, without having generations of an advantage where they extracted that wealth and extracted those resources. And so as we're thinking about the rise of multinational corporations, how they've garnered their profits, and we haven't even touched on the environmental issues that have come with that, and the countries that have really been damaged environmentally. We haven't talked about the impact of the climate crisis, where it is actually the global South that is bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, even though when you look at CO2 carbon emissions, it's actually coming primarily from the global North. And so when we think about revenue and profit sharing and tax policy at a global level, it can't be that we're saying we'll just assess a tax on multinationals and then we'll give some of that to some of these more poor countries. It has to actually be, those countries need to be at the table, and they actually should be driving the conversation of what parity looks like, of what an adequate sharing of resources looks like, given the historical context. And a lot of times these conversations happen and it's just sort of, forward thinking and looking ahead, but we can't develop these policies in a vacuum. And we can't say that we're going to move forward without acknowledging how we've gotten to this level of inequality to begin with, and how many of these economies had been disadvantaged up to this point. And so this is something that these are happening now, these conversations are emerging, but it's important to place them in the context of what's already happening, for example, in Africa with the different countries, with moving forward with the AfCFTA, with leadership actually starting to assert more fully their independence from practices of the past that link them closely to their former colonizers. We're also seeing that at the grassroots level in many of these countries, you're seeing more more obvious, and this might be in part because of social media and access to social media, but you're seeing more calls for a different kind of leadership. You're seeing a lot of criticism of leadership in these countries that had been in lockstep with European leaders like Macron or Boris Johnson in the UK and what have you. So you're actually seeing regular people on ground in the Caribbean, in Africa, who are now exerting pressure upwards to their own leadership. And we've seen as some transitions have happened in Uganda. There was an election, and Bobby Wine was contending against Museveni, who's been in office for a very long time. He is a relic of that colonial past. And you've seen a lot of agitation at the grassroots level, meaning that not only is it these shifts are not just happening on their own. There's a pressure being exerted from the grassroots level to existing leadership in these countries, as well as leaders that are coming in with different ideas that are not as tied into the colonial past, that are saying that we actually want to exert our own agenda for our own country. And that is forcing other countries, particularly in the global north, to have to now renegotiate how they engage Africa. And that includes the United States. So the US right now has to rethink their attempts to establish bilateral trade agreements, for example, with Kenya, sort of going around the AfCFTA and trying to go to each individual country. Now, because of AfCFTA and because of this developing sort of unified front, they now have to think differently about how to engage countries more so on the term of African countries and Africa as a whole, as opposed to what it has been, which has been primarily about US interests. So these shifts are happening now. It's, again, I think, been exacerbated and accelerated because of COVID-19. A lot of the questions and things that have come up now as we talk about what parity looks like and what development looks like have become they've emerged even more because we've seen how COVID-19 has exposed a lot of the inequality. We've actually seen that right here in the United States, but it definitely has done that around the world. And so it is sort of accelerating the shift to a new paradigm that forces us to think about what economic parity looks like, what power looks like, and how these shifts actually occur. So it's an exciting time. I've been, just sort of following along as closely as possible, and have been involved in these conversations, and yeah, just excited to share this information with you.
Thank you so much. I mean, this was a super interesting and very very thought-provoking presentation. I think it's something that many people in the United States are not as aware as they should be, right? It's just not on people's radar screen as much, and yet it's one of the fundamental potential transformations that we see in sort of global inequalities. I want to start with a very broad question. And I was struck by your choice of the term parity in your title and in how you think about it. And it's parity, not equality, not rights or justice. Tell us a little bit why you think parity is a important concept here and what it means in this context.
Sure. So yeah, I was very particular about parity because for so long the balance of power has simply been there has been no balance of power. And so when you think about the relationship between European countries and African countries that were exploited, they've never been on par. So even after independence, these countries, these European countries, established economic frameworks and political frameworks, even to the point of making sure that the presidents that they wanted were in office, who would operate not in the interests of the African people, but in the interest of the colonial entity that was benefiting from the resources that they had been extracting. So you can't have, when we talk about things like what resources and what profit sharing, there almost is no conversation that is happening because they're not on par. And so even in the instance of the president of Ghana saying, well, we're no longer going to export our cocoa to get processed there, we'll do it ourselves. What that does is it starts to bring more parity. It starts to bring them up to where they're able to engage as partners as opposed to as agents of another state. And so company states imply that that state itself does not have its own agency, that it exists for the sole purpose of enriching and benefiting the colonizing entity. And that has been the dynamic on the continent for generations. And so as now we're seeing these countries start to recognize that they have to build their own systems, they have to build their own infrastructure, they have to assert some measure of independence because it's in their interest. Now we're starting to see that there is parity. For me, when I think I also, a lot of my work is informed by notions of justice. And I think where the justice comes in is in recognizing that historical context. And so again, when we're talking about profit sharing, it's not just what scraps from the profits we toss over to these countries. It is, how do you repair that historical harm? And then how do we make sure that moving forward, these countries have their own agency to make decisions, to contribute to the dialogue on par with everyone else, as opposed to being an afterthought or just to be considered after the fact, which has been the dominant paradigm, unfortunately, for so long.
Now, I thought there was an interesting slight tension in terms of how you presented it. You drew a lot of historical roots to colonialism and colonialism as a form of capitalism, as part of capitalist development in Europe and North America. And at the same time, the solution that you discussed is a free trade area, and is essentially, some people would say, is the very same neoliberal market projects that has undermined African development before. So what is different at the more fine-grained level with this form of capitalism that will not get us into a similar situation that the previous system got us?
Sure. And so this is one of the things that, just the areas that I think is that there's just so much there. And so capitalism it required the extraction and essentially the oppression and the extraction of the entire continent. It was necessary. You had to have this transatlantic slave trade in the capitalist frame. And so it has been incredibly damaging. It requires sort of a major underclass. So I'm obviously not a fan of capitalism. I've never really been a fan of capitalism.
Not that obvious. Some people are, right?
But the reality is, now looking at the free trade area and looking at how countries who essentially had adopted it was exported. And so unfortunately, what happens when you halt the progression and the progress in a country or in an area, they are not allowed to form their own sort of political and economic framework. That was halted when you had sort of this colonial interference that essentially made the whole world have to buy into this capitalist system. So multinationals and global trade and even globalization, it was all sort of established as this is the framework that you have to operate within. And it was largely because you did not have because there was no parity in power. they had been so weakened that they almost were absorbed into this capitalist framework. And so with that development now moving toward the AfCFTA, it's sort of saying, okay, to what extent can we take pieces back of ourselves? To what extent do we now begin to put ourselves back into the driver's seat of developing a framework that actually makes sense for us? Yes, it is still within this broader capitalist frame, but for me, at least in my view, it's having the agency to say, okay, how do we build a system that actually makes sense given our culture, given our traditions, given where we're situated in the world? And that conversation has to start somewhere. A lot of the cultures in Africa were communal. They were based on notions of communalism, and you'll hear a lot about socialism. But for me, every country, every area should have, and ideally would have the right to build their own economic framework based upon what makes the most sense for them. They would build their own political framework based upon what makes the most sense for them. And that includes the notion of exporting democracy around the world, or a certain form of democracy. And so, but you can't do that if you don't have agency, or if those conversations aren't being had. So it's sort of taking from where things are and the system that unfortunately they were absorbed into, and starting to now pull out of that system to assess it and say, how do we actually shape a system that actually works for where we are and that makes sense and is in the best interest of our people? And it's a process, but I think now we're starting to see more steps moving to start to assess, why do we exist in this framework, and how do we build a framework that actually makes more sense for us?
So it's sort of an assertion of economic power at the same time that as political power, and sort of strengthening the economic clout through the collaboration that creates a less unequal political sort of balance. Would that be a appropriate way of looking at it?
Yeah, it would create a less imbalance politically, but I also think that it would open the door, or my hope with that is that it would open the door for conversations about restructuring, so that, you know, critical assessments of capitalism, critical assessments of neoliberalism. And we know what capitalism looks like because we live it, right? And so even as it's being touted, we also know about the number of folks who are homeless, the number of folks who don't have access to food, we know that. And so we know that that's not the ideal system. My hope is that this opens up space for countries to look at their own sort of cultural values and traditions and incorporate that to build an economic system that actually makes sense. And so it will have an impact on what we've understood as globalization and everyone sort of being in the same pot. But even with globalization, it was always this imbalance. It was always to the benefit of the wealthiest countries, and everyone else was sort of at their service. I think if we continue to move in this direction, it will hopefully build more self-sufficient, self-sustaining countries who have agency, where they can determine how they engage the rest of the world.
That's great. I think you alluded to it a little bit, and maybe you can say a little bit more about the sort of, who are the drivers within African societies of this movement toward asserting a independent economic and political and cultural way, and who are maybe the resistors, right? So because he also strongly suggested that this is a not just a path toward greater global equality, but also really generates forces that changes local political systems, regional political systems. So who are within societies, who are the drivers behind this, and what kind of changes do you think would go along with this, that come out of it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, again, a lot of the drivers are just the realities that people are experiencing. I think that there is pressure from the grassroots, just the dissatisfaction with the quality of life. I think there is a lot more pressure. I think that is much more obvious because of access to information, because of social media, the ability for people to mobilize. We've seen that a lot, mobilization around the world. Even in, for instance, with what happened last summer with the uprisings around George Floyd, we saw across the world people were able to mobilize and get access to information. So I think there is definitely that pressure. I also think that, generations that are coming up now are less tolerant of those previous paradigms and those previous frameworks. I think I've seen more interest in different economic frameworks. So even seeing in Europe, they're talking about donut economics. They're talking about the circular economy, these concepts that seem new, but if you go back to a lot of indigenous cultures, and that was just the way things were done. And now they're actually coming up as new economic frameworks in Europe. And so I think those kinds of pressures are what are driving this change in direction. But there are potential obstacles. One of the questions that I see came up in the chat is around the United States and President Biden saying that they're going to invest in the U.S. infrastructure, and would that investment toward the U.S. be a detriment to the AfCFTA's infrastructure goals? And we know that the United States has an incredible amount of influence. And I mean, we had previous 4 years of Make America Great Again and bringing everything back. And that's going to happen. I think that's fine. I actually think that it won't have a significant effect on the direction that the continent is moving in. Again, the question is, how much will the United States respect the agenda set forth in the AU 2063 and the AfCFTA? So will they acknowledge this new trading paradigm, or will they try to independently negotiate their bilateral trade agreements? And so that gets to, do they respect the direction that things are moving on the continent, or do they not? And so those are some barriers, but I think that the momentum is on sort of moving in this other direction.
I'm going to switch focus slightly. There have been a number of questions around the relationship and the reconfigured relationship of the continent to other global, centers of power. And the one that was mentioned repeatedly is the role of China and the relationship between China and African countries, and how do you see this sort of the new balance of power in the global north that is connected with the rise of China affecting African development and African agency in this global economy?
Sure. So we saw, so we have seen a shift in the relationship with China. So for many years, China's strategy in Africa was different from the previous colonial relationships, in the sense that they did not come with the blatant transatlantic slave trade and extraction. What they did is they negotiated deals. They knew that there was a significant need for capital on the continent. Even to build infrastructure in Africa requires significant capital investment, whether that's trains, roads, bridges, and the like. And so China had access to capital. They needed resources. And so they negotiated deals. And we saw that they did a lot of that across the continent, where they were involved in whether it was airports and other major infrastructure projects. And it really created this relationship to the point where, for example, Zambia has so much of its infrastructure is directly tied to China. But what we've also seen, especially even last year, was you started to see this emerging suspicion as of late with the relationship between African countries and China. You're starting to see these rumblings of dissatisfaction. One, why is it that this infrastructure is maintained by Chinese companies and actual Chinese employees? Why don't African countries build up the ability to maintain the infrastructure even after it's built, right? You also started to see some African leadership, again, because you're seeing some of that grassroots pressure, starting to say, we've got to reassess some of these deals that we've negotiated with China. In one instance that I think, I forget the African leader, but he said only a madman would negotiate such a deal. So you started to see this pushback that was driven by the suspicion And again, by questions, why do we have to be now tied to China the same way we were tied to European countries? And kind of seeing that earlier on so that they can now renegotiate their relationship with China. And so for a long time, there was this mass movement from China into Africa. But now, again, you're seeing this kind of consciousness where it's saying, okay, we don't want to get into the same situation where we don't have access to our own infrastructure, where we are deeply in debt to China to the point where we have no agency. So again, the agency is the key word. And I think that's a situation that's still evolving.
Do you see parallels between European colonialism and Chinese influence, or is it fundamentally different?
Yes, it's different in the sense that, again, Chinese interaction with Africa was not done with the same blatant
Mm.
taking people, human capital out, and it was much more subtle in the sense that it came through deals, through contracts, through having capital, which Africa needed. So when you talk to some leadership, they'll say, well, we know we need capital, we need a thing. And so it's not just going in blind, right? They're saying we do need capital, we did need assistance with building this infrastructure, but now there's a sense that, okay, we're not going to go all the way down the path where we look up and all of our resources are being extracted, exported, where we don't have internal capabilities of maintaining the infrastructure that was built. So they're able to, I think, get out in front of it in a way that did not happen with European countries. And there was a question that came in about some of the Lusophone countries. So these are the former Portuguese colonies, and saying that Portugal did not benefit as much, or it's not considered a rich country. And so how do these shifting dynamics affect Mozambique, Angola, all of these countries, Portuguese speaking or Lusophone countries in Africa? And to that, yes, Portugal perhaps did not have as blatant a way of engaging with the countries that they colonized. But I think even in some of those countries, they are also moving in a different direction. And so we've seen Angola actually prosecuting the daughter of the head of state, Isabel dos Santos, for massive corruption and taking money out of the country. And in fact, she was residing in Portugal. And you're seeing this attempt to claw back resources that were leaving the state. And that's what you see in many of these countries as well. So even those that in Portugal, that they perhaps were not operating in the same way as the French or the same way as the Belgians, but the countries in Africa are still, you're still starting to see that, okay, how do we make sure that we are able to keep our resources, that we address sort of this generations long extraction and exploitation that's been happening.
Maybe as a sort of an opportunity for some closing thoughts, you mentioned various forms of capital, and I think the big one is of course simply financial capital and capital accumulation, but also the human capital aspects of growing to some extent, repatriating human capital. How do you best foster that development, which seems critical for long-term, sort of sustained growth and assertiveness of African economy? And I'm thinking of the domestic education systems, but also the way in which capital inflows are used to not be as extractive as they have in the past, and basically build capital within the continent.
Yes, so it's definitely a process. I had mentioned earlier that the influence and the role that perception and narratives about the continent affect its ability to attract the kind of investment, and even for people to go back to the continent, or to go to the continent in general. And I mean, those narratives are incredibly powerful. We can all point, I know when I was growing up, seeing the commercials about, the poor African child, and or the only time you heard about anything on the continent was through the lens of a war or unrest or conflict. And we know, yes, there is conflict, there is war, although it's important to understand the genesis of a lot of those conflicts are not just, they didn't just pop up. And even things that are characterized as religious or ethnic conflict, they also can be tied back in many instances to the colonial history. And even some of these actors, I think it was the French that just admitted that they had provided the weapons, the machetes that were used in Rwanda in the 1994 genocide, right? And so all we're hearing is the negatives and the conflict. We're not getting the real story behind the conflict. And then no one wants to go to a place where they believe it's going to be unsafe or that they don't know that there's anything there. But if you've been to Africa, it's very evident that there is a lot of wealth, a lot of natural resources, incredible human capital. Again, it's the youngest continent. And so all of that, for it to be harnessed for the benefit of Africa and Africans, and also saying Africans in Africa and abroad. So again, reaching out to African Americans, reaching out to Africans in Honduras, in Venezuela, in those even in Europe, and saying that they are still a part of the continent, and there's an opportunity for them to go back to the continent in whatever way makes sense. If that is through investment, if that is through bringing your business or expanding your enterprise on the continent, if it's for tourism, to go on vacation. You'd be surprised how few people, as many beaches, as many, that it's not a major tourist destination. And so that awareness, I think, is a huge part of it. The perception, the awareness, and then understanding how much opportunity exists in Africa, but engaging in a way that is not sort of with that exploitative lens. Like, it's not to go and let me grab what I can grab. It's to say this is a continent, these are countries, these are people that have their own agency, that we would engage on par. Again, that issue of parity, as opposed to going in for a land grab or a resource grab, or in a very exploitative manner, which has unfortunately been a lot of the history.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We're out of time, so we probably could continue this conversation for a long time, and I hope we get a chance at some point. So thank you very much for joining today and sharing your insights and expertise. For those of you who tuned in, thanks for joining too, and please subscribe to our email list so you receive updates for future webinars. And just as a quick announcement, the next webinar will be on May 4th, as always on Tuesdays at noon. And we will examine the intersection between narco trafficking, state making, and inequality in the context of Mexico and Colombia. And our speakers will be Lena Britta, who is the Associate Professor of History here at Northwestern, and Dawn Mary Paley, who's an independent journalist who's written extensively on that topic. So until then, be well, stay healthy, and we'll see you then. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.